never asked the right questions. They assumed your silence meant detachment, that your lack of movement was stagnation. They couldn't fathom that you were calculating, building a framework inside your mind that didn't need their noise to function. Every comment they made, every gesture they threw, every lie whispered in your absence. You remembered it all, not for vengeance, but for alignment. You didn't react because you weren't in the same temporal rhythm as them. While they moved hour to hour, desperate for applause, you thought in arcs. You were playing the long game, watching emotional weather patterns until it was time to strike with presence alone. You didn't guess how it would unfold. You engineered it. They're disoriented now, not because you outplayed them, but because everything's unfolding exactly as you said it would, and they didn't listen. That's the part they can't digest. You didn't predict the future like some mystic sitting in candlelight. You understood pattern recognition. You studied behaviors, instincts, inconsistencies. You listened more than you spoke, and when you did speak, it wasn't loud, it was precise. But they mocked it, dismissed it, laughed, until time caught up and every warning you never voiced turned into consequence. They thought chaos was random, forgetting that even destruction follows laws of nature. You simply learned how to read it while they played with matches. It wasn't luck, it wasn't magic. It was clarity you saw through the illusions they worshipped, the forced smiles, the fabricated alliances, the manipulations dressed as jokes. While they celebrated victories built on emotional counterfeit, you were designing something unshakable. You saw the cracks in their structures, hairline fractures that others ignored, and you knew where to apply pressure. You knew where silence would be more lethal than confrontation. That's what unsettles them now. It's not just that you were right, it's that you made being right look effortless, strategic, elegant. They called you paranoid when you became quiet. Said you were too serious, too intense, too cold. But beneath that calm, you were mapping possibilities. You were stepping outside the scene and viewing it like an architect examining faulty beams. Every betrayal, every power play, every whispered distortion, they all followed a rhythm. And once you noticed the rhythm, you no longer felt threatened. You just waited. Because time is a cruel magnifier. It either exposes or confirms. And for them, it did both. What they see as prophecy, you know as preparation. That's the real twist. They believed you bent reality, when in truth, you simply respected it more than they ever did. They're panicking now, asking each other, how did they know? Desperate to find the surveillance they swear must exist, but there was no camera, no microphone, just you fully present, fully detached, observing without ego, listening without needing to be heard. You didn't interfere because you didn't need to. You trusted that everything false eventually caves under its own weight. And now it's happening. The alliances they formed to isolate you are devouring themselves. The rumors they planted are circling back like boomerangs laced in irony. The people they weaponized are pulling away, because they realized too late that the one they tried to outmaneuver had already walked past the board. They underestimated you because you didn't posture. You weren't obsessed with being seen. And in their world, invisibility equals insignificance. But you knew something deeper, that absence of noise isn't weakness. It's power that's still loading. While they were proving, you were refining. While they were performing, you were perceiving. Your stillness wasn't passive, it was observational warfare. And when the storm began unfolding exactly as you foresaw, they didn't just lose control, they lost the illusion that they ever had it. You never interrupted them. You just stepped out of their echo chamber, and in doing so, you killed the script they wrote with your name on it. People think you must be dramatic to predict outcomes, that you need visions, dreams, warnings. But all you need is pattern. Most people don't change, they reveal. And once they reveal themselves, the game is already over. You didn't respond emotionally because you weren't emotional. You were surgical. You turned every wound into data, every silence into a clue, and you waited, not for revenge, but for the moment reality would come back to collect its debts. They thought your calm meant confusion. They didn't understand that you weren't silent because you had no plan. You were silent because the plan didn't need explaining. Now they sit in conversations that revolve around your name, not out of admiration, but out of confusion. The roles have reversed. They're the ones trying to decode you. But you're not even in the room. You're not arguing. You're not defending. You're not proving. Because when reality follows your plan, it speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Your absence now echoes louder than their presence. You became the storm they thought they could outrun. But it wasn't a storm. It was inevitability. One you built with surgical patience while they were too distracted with shallow victories. They'll never admit it. But the way their voices soften when they mention you, the way their sentences trail off when describing what happened, that tells the truth. They thought you needed to win arguments. You needed to win nothing. You needed only time. And time became your ally because you knew something they refused to consider: lies expire, performances collapse, and truth, no matter how suppressed, erupts. You didn't rush to expose them. You let their own trajectory do the work. That's what haunts them now. Not that you destroyed them, but that you didn't need to. They thought they were leading. That's what made it tragic. Every outburst, every smug accusation, every attempt to draw you into the familiar chaos. They believed they were orchestrating the tempo, but you weren't reacting. You were listening with the patience of someone who already knew where the road would end. You didn't flinch. You didn't match the energy. You observed patterns, registered micro-expressions, decoded their insecurities, and filed everything into mental archives they didn't even know existed. While they thrived on spontaneity, you were constructing blueprints in silence. They raised their voice. You raised your standard. They attacked your image. You dismantled theirs without needing a word. They were improvising. You were writing their next move before they even decided which mask to wear. They kept mistaking your pause for confusion, as if your stillness meant you hadn't caught on. But there's a difference between hesitation and preparation. You were still because you were building, inside. Building emotional armor that looked like indifference but was forged in exactitude. You didn't need to defend yourself because you understood something deeper. When someone is stuck in ego, their decisions are already pre-scripted. Their need to be right, their thirst for control, their compulsive need to maintain an image. These were predictable variables. You didn't need to guess. You just needed to let them walk the path you had already mapped out for them, step by arrogant step. They thought they were catching you off guard, but they were only fulfilling a prophecy you'd written in silence. They believed they were baiting you into self-destruction. But every time they poked, you took a note, not to retaliate, but to update the script, to tighten the narrative, to make their next move feel like it was their idea when it was always yours. That's the cruelty of being outmatched by someone you underestimated. You don't even realize how many of your spontaneous decisions were reactions to traps placed months ago. You weren't reacting to them. You were sculpting them. You gave them just enough space to feel in control, while slowly limiting every meaningful option they thought they had. And by the time they realized the walls were closing in, you had already stepped out of the maze. They tried to frame you, discredit you, gaslight you, but each move revealed something. A fear, a pattern, a desperation. You took none of it personally because you were already charting the collapse. Your silence wasn't empty, it was calculating. And while they argued with your ghost, you were 4 moves ahead, making sure the final scene didn't require your presence. That's what makes control lethal. Not when it dominates, but when it disappears and lets others destroy themselves with freedom they think they own. You didn't need to dismantle them. You just needed to step back and let gravity do its job on structures built from lies. They thought strategy looked like aggression. They thought domination came through voice, through showmanship, but true domination lives in subtlety. You responded to their insults with silence that rewrote the rules. You let them finish their speech and answered it with absence. You didn't challenge them head on. You gave them a stage and let their ego script its own ending. They assumed they were improvising power when really, you'd designed the parameters long before the curtain rose. That's the highest form of foresight. To orchestrate a scenario where they unknowingly execute your plan while thinking it's theirs. People don't realize how readable they are until they meet someone who's spent more time in reflection than in reaction. You didn't become unreadable. You became fluent in the language of behavior. You watched how their tone shifted when they lied, how their gaze wandered when they felt threatened. You clocked how their laughter was always a bit too loud when guilt lived underneath it. While they were distracted by optics, you were dissecting patterns, and once you understand the patterns, the future becomes a formula. You didn't predict their next move by magic. You wrote it into their nature and waited for them to live it. They expected you to protest, to shout, to demand justice or loyalty or closure. But you gave them none. You gave them freedom, the deadliest kind. You let them run unchecked in a playground you had already measured. They mistook your grace for apathy. They didn't know your distance was precision. And when the storm began to turn, when the truths began to unfold, they panicked. Not because of what was happening, but because of how accurately it mirrored what you would have predicted had they ever let you speak. But you never needed to say it. You were writing it while they slept. They accused you of being too passive, too cold. They never realized you were simply beyond bait. Because once you learn that most chaos is recycled behavior acting out unresolved insecurity, you stop engaging with it as if it's new. You stopped dancing with dysfunction just to feel seen. You weren't reacting to their triggers because you had disarmed them in solitude. You weren't responding to their tactics because you had already rewritten your rules. They showed up with drama. You handed them a mirror. And while they performed, they didn't see you slowly turning the reflection into prophecy. They thought power meant knowing everything. But you knew the truth. Power is knowing just enough to stay invisible while you shape the entire outcome. They never felt your hands because you used time as your blade. You let patience sharpen the story until it cut without needing to swing. While they celebrated petty wins, you sat in the background adjusting the dominoes. Then one day, a single whisper, a single absence, a single truth tilted the first tile, and they watched everything fall in an order so precise it could only have been written. And you were already gone, watching from above, not with malice, but with knowing. They confused patience for passivity the same way fools confuse silence for surrender. They saw your stillness and assumed you were stuck. You heard their laughs, their whispered theories, their self-congratulating stories, but you didn't correct them. That was your first act of dominance. Let them talk. Let them assume. Let them believe the myth of their momentum. Because while they celebrated imaginary victories, you were building a foundation beneath their noise. A foundation forged in restraint, focus, and an eerie kind of calm that most people mistake for weakness. Until it uncoils. You weren't passive. You were planning. You weren't frozen. You were forming. And the day you moved, the room changed temperature without you saying a word. They kept testing you like a button on a broken machine, certain they could provoke a response. Their egos needed a reaction, even a negative one, to feel validated. But you gave them nothing. Not because you were incapable, because you were uninterested. The game they were playing was outdated. They thought endurance was a lack of options. They never considered that you were choosing to wait. Not because you couldn't strike, but because you knew the moment they slipped, the opening would reveal itself without effort. You didn't need to chase revenge. You waited for it to become redundant. Your patience was never passive, it was predatory. They mistook your delayed reactions as a sign of detachment. It was the opposite. You were observing every move they made. You saw the cracks in their alliances. You watched the performance. You documented every attempt to manipulate perception. And while they performed under fluorescent lights, you studied them in shadows. Patience gave you access to truths people reveal only when they think they're winning. You let them expose themselves, every boast, every half-truth, every subtle betrayal they thought you didn't notice. They didn't realize you weren't playing along. You were just tightening the narrative they were writing with their own delusion. They needed you to be impulsive. They had prepared counters for your rage, comebacks for your aggression. They were armed for a war of emotion, not a silence so steady it shook their footing. You weren't reacting. You were absorbing, not the pain. They don't deserve that kind of importance. You were absorbing data, calculating, letting time filter truth from noise. You knew one thing they couldn't grasp. Chaos is exhausting, but patience is renewable. Every time they made a move and you didn't respond, they grew louder, more erratic. They tried harder to pull you back into their storm. You stood in the eye of it, unmoved. What haunted them wasn't your anger. It was your composure. The way you stopped explaining. The way you let their accusations hang in the air unanswered. They wanted a fight. They got a mirror. And in that silence, they saw something they weren't ready to confront. How much of their identity was built on your reaction? When that vanished, so did their illusion of control. You didn't ghost them. You outgrew the frequency. Patience gave you altitude. And from up there, you could see the entire landscape of their illusion collapse under its own ego. They thought they were getting away with it. Whatever was. Lies, manipulation, performance. They were too addicted to their own image to imagine someone watching without responding. Your stillness made them arrogant. Your patience made them sloppy. And in that sloppiness, they told on themselves, to the world, to each other, and eventually to you. You didn't need revenge. You needed clarity. And patience gave it to you in a dosage so exact, it turned betrayal into a blueprint. You weren't waiting for a moment to hurt them. You were waiting for the moment they would expose who they truly were, without you lifting a single word to provoke it. They treated you like a placeholder, like someone who could be replaced or dismissed. But placeholders don't stay calm in chaos. Placeholders don't outlast storms. You weren't temporary. You were timeless. And what they saw as inactivity was actually power in its most distilled form, control of the self. You weren't waiting for their apology. You weren't hoping for a change of heart. You were observing the expiration of their role in your story. They kept speaking. You kept watching. And when you finally moved, it wasn't out of rage. It was out of necessity. To reintroduce yourself, not to them, but to the version of you that had outlived the need to be understood. They call it cold now, detached, emotionless. But they forget the warmth they once took for granted. The fire you used to burn just to make them comfortable. Your patience was the furnace where your boundaries were reforged. You let them speak without interruption, hoping they'd hear their own madness. And they did too late. You didn't change overnight. You just stopped shrinking. And because they confused your grace for compliance, your silence for fragility, your absence became a kind of punishment they couldn't name. They started chasing closure. But you had already crossed the threshold where closure was irrelevant. They retell the story now, each time with more edits, trying to find a version where you're the villain. Because it's easier to believe that you abandoned them than admit they wasted your presence. But somewhere deep down, they know the truth. You weren't waiting for them to collapse. You were simply giving them space to grow, or space to rot. The outcome was never yours to force. That's the secret. Patience doesn't manipulate, it reveals. It's not passive, it's poetic. And when the curtain finally fell, your absence spoke louder than any of their performances ever could. And now, they study your stillness the way people study a locked vault, searching for weakness, looking for a way back in. But they'll never find the entrance again. Because the version of you they thought they were outsmarting, provoking, and cornering, that version evolved in silence. Your patience was your revolution. Not loud, not theatrical, but surgical, unflinching, irrefutable. And now that they've finally learned the difference between passivity and power, all they can do is sit with the truth. That while they were reacting, you were rebuilding. While they chased noise, you became an empire. And you built it brick by invisible brick, smiling in the silence they never respected. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation in disguise, and they never knew the difference. They thought you were drained, broken, overwhelmed by the weight of what they did. They whispered theories about your distance. They speculated that you couldn't handle confrontation, that your quiet was weakness dressing itself up as dignity. But silence, in your world, is never passive. It's a weapon you sharpen in the dark. It's the battlefield you build when the noise of fools threatens to drown out your precision. You weren't backing down. You were running numbers behind your eyes. While they talked over each other, mistaking volume for dominance, you were mapping routes in your mind, deciding not whether to strike, but when and how silently you could end what they believed couldn't be touched. They mistook the stillness for surrender because they don't understand control without theatrics. They were addicted to immediacy, instant response, fast emotion, explosive confrontation. It fed their need for spectacle. And you gave them none of it. You let their monologues echo unanswered. You let their slander drift into dead air. You didn't correct their narratives, didn't rise to their provocations. You processed. You took the long route. And in a world obsessed with instant gratification, that patience rattled them. Because your silence made their chaos feel pointless. Their moves echoed into a void, and they started realizing, too late, that the absence of your voice was not absence at all. It was presence turned to strategy. Your calculation began the moment they assumed the game was over. They thought silence meant checkmate. You knew it meant reset. You used every pause, every non-response to gather precision. Not pettiness. Precision. You calculated their weaknesses, not just in words, but in timing. You watched how quickly they turned on each other. How fragile their stories became without your presence to stabilize them. And every second you stayed silent, they became more animated, more theatrical, more self-exposing. You didn't need to pull strings. You just waited while they tangled themselves in them. They needed a reaction. It was their currency. Your anger would have justified their guilt. Your defense would have validated their accusations. But you gave them nothing to spin. That was the calculation, a deliberate withholding of energy. You starved their delusion of oxygen. They choked on their own narrative, wondering why it didn't land, why people didn't believe them as easily as before. Because without your reaction, their drama looked exactly as it was. Fabricated. You weren't fighting back. You were letting their ego perform solo in a spotlight they didn't know you designed. You stepped back not to retreat, but to reveal the architecture of their lies. You knew the cost of reaction. You knew it would feed their control. So you chose the quiet route, the sharper one lined with precision and psychological clarity. You weren't ignoring them. You were observing them unravel. You let their accusations pile up. You let their assumptions echo. And when they finally looked up and saw that the silence had not broken, they started to tremble. Because silence is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of self-restraint. And yours held weight. It held memory. It held all the truths you didn't have to scream for them to be real. Your calculation was so clean that when the collapse came, no one could trace it back to you. And that made it surgical. They begged for a sign that you were suffering. Because if you weren't suffering, it meant you never lost. If you weren't reacting, it meant they didn't win. And the more silent you stayed, the more that truth festered in them. They needed your validation to make their manipulation feel like justice. And you denied it. You denied them the comfort of knowing they still had impact. And that denial was power. Not overt, not aggressive, but undeniable. You redefined power by showing them that the most devastating revenge is found not in words, but in evolution. You didn't go quiet out of fear. You went quiet because you learned that emotion is energy, and energy is investment. You stopped investing in what had already proven bankrupt. You weren't hoping for change. You were waiting for exposure. And it came, slowly, spectacularly. Your silence became a countdown, not to confrontation, but to revelation. And when it arrived, it didn't shout, it echoed. Because when truth finally enters the room, it doesn't announce itself, it rearranges the furniture. And suddenly they were standing in a space they no longer controlled, surrounded by consequences they thought they'd outsourced to time. The irony. They thought your silence made you invisible. But silence doesn't make you disappear. It makes you omnipresent. It haunted them, followed them into conversations. It sat at their tables when your name was mentioned, and no one responded the way they expected. Because silence turns into presence when it's held with certainty. They felt it. In glances. In doubt. In the way people stopped laughing at their jokes about you. You hadn't said a word, but your calculation was loud. It rewrote the social script without needing to plead your case. You were silent. Yes, but you were never gone. Now, when they look back, they see it. The restraint, the brilliance of your silence. They try to rewrite the story to make themselves look like the architect of your disappearance. But deep down, they know. You weren't destroyed. You were deliberate. You were never waiting to be saved. You were waiting for them to reveal who they truly were. Without interference, without influence, without interruption. And they did. You never needed to expose them. They walked into that verdict on their own. And now, they live with a kind of regret that can't be soothed. Regret rooted in the realization that they triggered their own unraveling. And all you did was stay silent long enough to let it happen. That silence they mocked, the one they treated as a weakness, now echoes louder than any retaliation ever could. It wasn't surrender. It was your final, flawless move. And now, every time they hear your name, every time the consequences ripple out in conversations they no longer control, they remember that silence. Cold. Calculated. Lethal. They used their voice to try and destroy you. You used your silence to end them. Not through destruction, but through design. Through the kind of chess move only a quiet mind could make.